And thanks everybody for being here. I was very gratified to be asked to introduce Nicole because I am a fan of hers, but it's also very difficult. I mean, she's from the Vineyard, I'm from the Vineyard. She went to Harvard, I went to Harvard. She's written like at least 8 more books than I have. And Anne has created for us the amazing Shakespeare for the Masses, which is one of the best things about living on the Vineyard year-round. It's worth coming here in the winter for Shakespeare for the Masses. Super, super great. And additionally, we have both reported for both of the island's weekly newspapers, both of whom appear under slightly changed names in her wonderful novel, her latest of at least 8. Actually more, but she loses count. I enjoyed this book so much, and if you haven't had a chance to read it yet, then I expect you to go grab one, either physically so you can have it autographed, or in your Kindle the way I did. It's beautifully told, affectionate, Martha's Vineyard story with just enough of suspense to keep the pages turning, and also just people you like to know. Some of whom you might think you already know, but they have different names.
Some of whom you probably do already know.
So I have to ask you, how did you bring yourself after you wrote Stepdog, you wrote the novel, the sort of the speculative fiction novel with Neil Stephenson, and then your 5 historical novels, and she delves into the backstories of characters, misunderstood characters like Lady Godiva and Iago. So how did you bring yourself then to go domestic, come home and write a book so close to where you live?
Yeah, that was scary. I actually feel like in many ways when I write historical fiction, I'm writing autobiographically. I just am hiding it in 800 years of distance. But I find that the things that I tend to write about thematically in my historical fiction, mean a lot to me. And so I thought, well, why don't I just get rid of the pretense and get really close to the bone. When I first moved back to the Vineyard, I grew up here year-round. I graduated from the high school, and then I moved back about 12 years ago, and through a series of events that are beyond the scope of right now, I ended up writing freelance for the Gazette, and I was at a party somewhere, and I was talking with somebody about something that would have made a great story. And another person I was sitting with said, yeah, but that doesn't seem like it's a Gazette story. That seems like it's a MV Times story. And I said, well, maybe I can just write it for the Times. And the person looked at me shocked and said, you can't do that. If you write for the Gazette, you can't write for the Times. And I thought that was an exaggeration, and long story short, it's not. So the minute that I heard that, I thought, well, someone's got to write a story about that. And then 10 years later, no one had, so I figured I would. Yeah, that's the simple answer, I think.
What were the biggest challenges for you as far as writing a story that you knew people you knew would read?
I didn't want to upset anyone. I pulled a lot of punches because I didn't want to be disinherited. I didn't want to be shunned, and I also didn't want to take an absolute stand on things that I actually feel there's a lot of wiggle room with. So I allowed for a lot of gray areas because I didn't want to speak with literally authority, as if something was more true than something else. It's a lot more about perception than anything, which is why in the book there's a number of news items that are covered from the point of view of both of the papers, and it's very different because the papers are very different.
I have to say I enjoyed that. I enjoyed reading the different takes, because why have 2 papers if they're not going to be different? The more different, the better, I think,
right,
really.
Yes, so most people on the Vineyard, I mean, you guys all know this because most of you are Vineyarders, people either read the Times or they read the Gazette, or they read both. But there's no way that the 2 papers aren't really in competition with each other. It's not like there's someone who would only read the Gazette, except maybe they'd get seduced into only reading the Times. That doesn't actually happen. And yet the competition, I think, keeps both papers kind of on, sharp-ish.
Well, absolutely, they keep you on your toes. We heard the same thing when Patch came in. Oh, keep us on our toes.
Right,
and,
yeah.
The more the better in the media environment. But we've settled down. We know why we have 2 papers, because there are two major points of view,
Right, yeah,
usually
yeah.
about certain things like the environment, and you bring those out beautifully in the story.
Thank you so much. What I thought that I would do now, normally when I'm reading, there's a particular scene that I read that I've now read often enough that it's boring for me to read it, so I'm going to read some other stuff. The scene that I normally read, a little bit of it, is the scene where the protagonist meets the antagonist / love match. And the things that I like about that scene in particular appear in other places in the book. So I'm going to focus on those kinds of scenes, which are the scenes that really emphasize the different points of view of not just the two papers, but of the things that the two papers represent. And I'm going to start by just reading a little bit from an opening moment, and then I have some visual aids to back it up.
I'm going to sit with Mom and listen to
Oh, okay. So the premise of the book is that there's a woman who grew up here and went off island and became a writer, because it's not autobiographical at all. And then she has to come home in the middle of winter because her sole remaining relative here has a terrible accident. He falls off his roof and he breaks his leg, and he needs her to come and take care of him. So, and she has very mixed feelings about that, which get even more mixed as it goes on. There's a brewing class tension that gets worse as the story goes on. This is sort of all you need to know, and then I think most of what I'm going to read will be self-explanatory. There's a very wealthy seasonal resident in West Tisbury who has a helicopter, and he decides that he's just going to park his helicopter on his property even though he's not allowed to. The zoning board tells him to stop. They give him a cease and desist order. He just ignores it and keeps doing it, and then he proactively decides to sue the town for the right to use his helicopter and build a helipad in order to prevent the town from suing him or fining him or whatever. So that's the wow, I'm blanking on what the word is. It's been a very hot day. And thank you. That's the premise. There's another word. Anyway, premise is a good enough word. So so she's on the ferry coming home, and I'm just going to read a tiny little bit, and then, like I said, we have some visual aids. She's outside. She comes inside, and she sees a copy of the two newspapers, and one is called the Journal, one is called the News. And just so you can get a sense of the aesthetic, News is spelled N-E-W-E-S. There were copies of both island newspapers on this table, lying slightly askew as if forgotten by a distracted traveler. One was a slender, old-fashioned broadsheet, much larger than the New York Times, the sort of paper an Edwardian butler would iron for his master before serving it at breakfast. Its elegant masthead featured decorative scrolls and some invented coat of arms, and was crowned by a poetic quote which changed each issue. This issue's, appropriate to this season, was from Twelfth Night. When that I was and a little tiny boy, with hey ho, the wind and the rain, a foolish thing was but a toy, for the rain it raineth every day. William Shakespeare. The second paper was smaller and thicker, stuffed with advertising supplements, splashed with color, bedecked with peppy weather icons and taglines for articles waiting inside. Each paper sported a photo above the fold. The larger paper, the News, featured a large black and white shot of smiling teenagers standing hand in hand in medieval costumes on the lip of a stage. The depth of field created an almost three-dimensional effect. The foreground and background figures artfully blurred, those in the middle distance sharp and luminous under stage lights. Camelot enchants at the newly refurbished Performing Arts Center, the headline announced. The smaller paper, the Journal, had a sans serif headline that read, Vineyard youth lead state in marijuana use. There was a gripping color photo of a back door at the high school featuring a DEA officer with arms akimbo, staring straight toward the camera at three teenage boys with their backs to the viewer. Some things would never change. Those weeklies had defined themselves by their differences since the day, back in Joanna's childhood, that some disaffected newsies had rebelled and huffed themselves halfway across the island to launch the Journal. So that actually happened while I was writing this book. There was a week where those were the two headlines, and then it wasn't Camelot, though. It was something a little better, because Brooke Hardman Ditchfield, who's awesome, runs the theater department. So last week, we had this. We had the MV Times, storm causes trees, damage, outages, flooding. And I don't know if you can see that picture, but it's quite dramatic, flooding. The Gazette has a lovely picture of the Gayhead Lighthouse. And it says, after a melting heat wave last weekend and a storm that brought tornado warnings on Tuesday, by week's end, temperate summer weather had returned. I just love that this happened at just at the right moment. So, anyhow, so Joanna's gig when she's off island as a writer is that she interviews all sorts of people and gets them to talk about themselves very, very frankly, but she needs to be in the same room with them. So she can't really do that while she's stuck on the island. She starts working freelance for one of the papers, realizes that she can't actually pay her bills because she's got an apartment back in New York. So even though you're not allowed to write for both papers, she figures out a way to write for both papers. But it requires creating a secondary identity. And then in this day and age, managing to sort of keep that going. To me, that's Shakespearean more than anything, but it's harder to be Shakespearean in the digital age. Anyhow, so she manages to do that, and she's just started to do it when she finds herself in the situation of needing to go to a meeting where she's being both people at once, and I'm actually going to skip over the parts where she has to be both people at once, but this is the scene that I normally read the whole thing of, and I wrote it before it even looked feasible that Trump could be the Republican nominee, let alone that he could win. So some of the themes that are in it are, I keep forgetting that I wrote it that long ago. So she is at this meeting. It freaks her out because she knows so many people, and she feels like a little kid again and is trying to pretend she doesn't, which never, ever happened to me when I came home. And it's not a special town meeting. It's like a meeting that they would have at Howe's house or something. It's basically an informational meeting so that the town can talk about the fact that the ZBA is about to get sued by this very wealthy man. So she is trying to get ready to put on her reporter's hat and go to work. Nothing like direct democracy in action, said a man's voice close by. Absolutely, she said with gusto. It was a man about her age. His skin was pleasantly cappuccino-colored for a local in March. He might have been a Brazilian with accentless English, but something about him seemed very yacht club, so probably he was just a banker with a snowbird tan. He wore faded jeans, a heavy corduroy jacket over a down vest, and a Red Sox cap. But his carriage, the closeness of his shave, the boring neatness of his coiffure, were too suburban for the clothes. It's my first town meeting, he said quietly, looking reverent. It's fascinating. Ah, you a wash ashore? I'm from America. See, I know the lingo. He grinned at her. And you? Family's been here since 1692, she recited, or maybe 1705, depends on which great aunt you ask. He chuckled. You islanders, man, he said affably. You're more obsessed with lineage than the British royals. Our land's more fashionable than theirs, she said. We cost prohibitively more per square foot. Is that why you're anti-immigrant? She blinked. What? You're xenophobes. You don't want outsiders coming in. He had a friendly smile that took the sting out. It was just a description, one he found mildly entertaining. In fact, you're anti-immigrant and foolish because most immigrants to the Vineyard bring cash into the economy instead of taking money out of it. She blinked again. What vineyard did he live on? No, a lot of people send money back to Brazil or Estonia or the Czech Republic. We're okay with that because they work very hard for it and they're more reliable than a lot of the college kids. He shook his head. I mean the immigrants who come here to settle down and make a long-term home for themselves, the wash-ashores. She smiled dismissively. That's a misuse of the word immigrant. You're a transplant from one part of America to another. This place really could be its own little country, and anyone moving here to make a life for themselves better be on board with that, because things get done differently here. Isn't that why you all call the mainland America, as if you weren't America? She nodded. Okay, fair point. Sounds like immigration, but it's immigration that adds money to the economy. People who come here because they want to live here tend to have cash to sink into a nice piece of property, and they pay people to build their house and maintain their yard and teach them yoga and feed their kids. He gestured around the room. and subsidize their public buildings. I've seen photos of the old library. It was 2 little rooms on Music Street for like a century. A few decades later, and you've got the Club Med of bibliotheques. Wouldn't have happened without immigrants like me. He shrugged and gave her an almost sycophantic smile. She liked his eyes. She had a thing for dark eyes. Too bad he was talking nonsense. And I'm going to skip a bit. You so-called immigrants make it too expensive for most island families to continue to live here. You've priced me out of the market in my own hometown. I grew up on 7 acres that my uncle bought in his 20s on a fisherman's income from a retiring farmer. If I tried to buy the smallest possible buildable lot from him for 100 times what he paid for the whole thing, I'd be ripping him off. That's how insane real estate has become. I don't think most immigrants have that kind of impact on a local population. Actually, most American communities do well economically when they welcome immigrants. Let's check with the Wampanoag tribe. I'm not sure they'll be on board with that. I'll rephrase it, he said. The United States historically does well to welcome immigrants. But you have already made the convincing point that we're not like the rest of the United States, she said triumphantly. Whatever truisms you want to push about America are meaningless here. He shrugged. You look like somebody who appreciates a good library, he said. You're welcome. And then he gave her a killer smile. And then they continue to have those sorts of conversations pretty much for the rest of the book. So in case it's not clear to anyone, you probably already know this, and the visual aids probably helped, but the 2 newspapers very openly are geared towards very different audiences. Someone who used to work at the Boston Globe has said of the Gazette, it's sort of like an alumni magazine for the summer people, and the Times is intended to be like the business-friendly everyman's paper. That once upon a time that kind of translated to political lineups, but it's a lot more nuanced and complicated now, which is good because I think that reflects what it's actually like. Like it's the whole Republican-Democrat thing does not pan out, doesn't map smoothly onto what's actually going on with a lot of vineyard economics. Anyhow, but obviously the wealthier folks are more likely to enjoy the attitude that the Gazette has towards wealthier folks than is true for the wealthier folks reading the Times, and vice versa. The helicopter event is a stand-in for something that really was happening about 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago now, in which the 2 papers definitely came down. One came down on the side of the town and one came down on the side of the wealthy people, although both papers claimed absolutely that there was no bias whatsoever. There absolutely was. I was biased myself because a family member of mine was involved in this, so I didn't mind the one that was on the side of the town. Because my family member worked for the town. Anyhow, the 2 papers treating the 2 of the main populations of the vineyard very differently, tend to handle them differently, which is why there are a number of scenes in here where each paper writes about the same thing in different ways. The same person that she was just having that chat with earlier is later on having another chat with her. Let me see if I can find this. He does not know that she's writing for both papers. And in her guise as a writer for the news, which is the Gazette, she's officially writing for the Times, and she's in secret writing for the Gazette. And in secret writing for the Gazette, she has written a piece about somebody who works in the town government in West Tisbury. But it's a really lovely, friendly, warm, affectionate feature, because that's the kind of thing that you write for that particular paper. Sorry, I'm trying really hard to find the... Wow. I am so sorry. I can't find the actual thing I'm looking for. All right, I'm going to move on to the next one. I do not do well in the heat. Yeah. I could ask the author, but I don't think she does well in the heat either. I'm sort of bummed, because that was a great one, but I seem to have put the thing in the wrong page. This is just a ridiculous little paragraph that anyone that's ever spent the spring on Martha's Vineyard will be able to relate to. Each spring, the 2 papers competed compulsively to report the first Pinkeltinks. This year, a plumber had heard the shrill chorus of spring peepers, as Pinkeltinks were called off island, on his way out of a client's house on Lambert's Cove Road. Being nonpartisan, he had informed both of the papers, and both had immediately posted it online. But the Journal came out the day before the news, so the Journal got to herald the good news in print. It's spring! You read it here first! The editor, with close-lipped grin and terrier eyebrows raised high, was triumphant. That is, there are various and sundry things like that throughout the book, but for some reason I just seem to have missed the wrong, wow. That's so frustrating. Can you, well, so you should probably read the competition, I think is the sentence that I wanted. I could just start reading randomly, because so much of the, wow. Yes, yes. Can you hand me that, or what page is it on? Does it map onto?
154.
I'll just read it off the Kindle. There we go. Oh no, it is. I'm going to read it here. Yes, thank you. Okay. So she has written a piece for the competition, and he doesn't know that. And she is saying that there's not very much going on in the winter. And he says, the news, that's the competition, has some great feature writing. Do you read it? You should probably read the competition. Of course I read it, she said. It paints a very different picture of the island. Obviously, he said. They're much nicer to people like me, for starters. It's as if they have some awareness that we add something of value to the economy, like, I don't know, money. Also, the writing itself, some of it's great, like the piece they just did about an outgoing member of my personal nemesis, the Zoning Board of Appeals. This person has made my life difficult, and if I'd read about her in the Journal, she'd probably just strike me as an irritant. But I read about her in the news, and suddenly I appreciate her as a human being. I'd enjoy getting to know her. I value a newspaper that allows for that kind of reporting. Plus, they have poems sprinkled through the paper and little artistic images and aphorisms. They really capture the nuances and ethos of what makes this place so special. No offense, but the Journal presents the Vineyard as if it were just any other small town. The news really luxuriates in teeny little specific vineyardishnesses. So that is sort of what I wanted to read. Anyhow, there's a lot of that throughout the book, and one of the things that surprised me when I was reading it, I actually wish that I had mentioned this when we were talking about it, is how much class rage came up in me, like my inner white trash kid went through so much anger while I was writing it, while I was researching and thinking about it, and I thought, wow, I thought I was writing a comic novel. This is not going to be a comic novel. This is going to be like a dark, gritty. And then when I actually started writing it, I just couldn't go there. Like something about, it was almost like the process of planning it was cathartic. It was a sort of an exorcism. And then I pulled a lot of punches, partly because, like I said, I didn't want to completely disenfranchise myself from everyone I know and love. But also, I realized when push came to shove that anger is not a great story. Tension is a great story, but anger is not the same as tension. And in the interest of telling a story, which ultimately is every novelist's primary responsibility, it worked better to actually look at things from the other point of view. And so some of the best one-liners are actually the rich guy's one-liners. And because I came to respect his point of view as well, which allowed me to sort of make peace with the fact that I have this kind of schizophrenic relationship to the island. Yeah. And because I think I have time, I'm actually going to go back and read the rest of that scene where he meets her. Okay, so they're still talking. They've just met. You look like somebody who appreciates a good library, he said. You're welcome. And then he gave her a killer smile. I need a moment to process this conversation, she said. Take your time, he said expansively. After a weighted pause, I'm enjoying this. It's not your usual nice to meet you banter, is it? Actually, she said, if you consider the setting, it kind of is. She looked down toward her backpack, unzipped it, and began to pull out her laptop. Excuse me, but I need to find a place to set up shop. The laptop surprised him. You're taking notes? I'm covering the meeting for the Journal. Oh, that's the reactionary one that hates immigrants, he said. That is a ridiculous statement, she said. We have 2 Brazilian columnists who write in Portuguese. Well, your readers hate immigrants, he said. I've seen the online comment about Brazilians, not to mention the online comments about the wash-ashores. If you're not a 7th-generation plumber, you're not welcome here. That's not true, she retorted. My cousin's a 7th-generation plumber, and he offers below-market rental housing to a bunch of Brazilians. The rental part was true, but she doubted indoor plumbing existed 7 generations ago. Really? Good for him. Despite the suburban blandness, his expression was incredibly agreeable when smiling. It was the kind of smile most men lost forever when they hit adolescence. Yes, she said, trying not to enjoy his face quite so much. He does it on principle because he believes everyone who works for a living should have a place to live. And she couldn't help but add, it's a sort of passive-aggressive protest against people whose McMansions are driving the price of housing up. Oh, so he only likes certain immigrants, the fellow said, as if he had scored a point, the sort that match his idea of what the Vineyard should be, while disapproving of the ones who don't match his idea of what it should be. Totally unlike what happens to immigrants in mainland America. Right. She saw the town moderator moving up toward the podium. She had to focus. That's an interesting but specious comment, she said. Your parallel won't hold up to scrutiny. I could tear it apart in 15 seconds, but I have to don my reporter's hat now. She focused on her laptop, but she could feel him giving her the once-over. I'd love to hear you tear my parallel apart. How about a coffee sometime? She darted a look at him to see the mischievous gleam in his eye. Her mouth dropped open. She closed it quickly. A date? With a nice smile? Who lived here in March? Was she allowed to date? She shrugged. Okay, sure, she said with forced nonchalance, and studied his reaction from the corner of her eye. He looked surprised. You don't think I'm being inappropriate, he asked. It's a little forward, she said, but I don't get hit on very often, and at least you're asking to hear my expert opinion instead of telling me I have nice eyes. You do have nice eyes, he said. She felt herself blush, although she was not the blushing type. There was a silent moment as she tried to contain the blush, but this only made her blush more. Finally, she answered, Thanks. He bit his lower lip. Oh, crap, did I just ruin the vibe here? No, you just changed it a little, she said, knowing she absolutely had to retreat from this conversation and put her reporter's hat back on. Enough to make it a drink instead of coffee? Butterflies. Instant case of butterflies. Wow, that was fast. Let's start with coffee, she said as calmly as she could. Of course, and seriously, if you think I'm inappropriate, I get it. I don't think you're inappropriate, she said, and smiled despite herself. You prefer text or email, he said, and almost before she realized what she was doing, she had recited her cell number to him. But at that moment, thank God, she thought, Peter Cook, the town moderator, who looked like a bearded hippie farmer version of Richard Burton, called the meeting to order. Everything is damp and sticky in the heat. If everyone could just turn your attention up here, said Peter Cook, we can get started. A pause as the buzz settled. As all of you know, this is an informal forum. It's not a selectmen's meeting or a ZBA meeting or a special town meeting. We're not here to make any decisions or to look at any language, but we want to get the sense from the town about some possibilities, including at the request of the selectmen, the possibility of raising and appropriating an extra $100,000 as a war chest in case of unexpected legal action. Or not. We're looking at all possibilities, and we're looking for your ideas. Okay, so should I text or call? Her new friend whispered. He used the excuse of whispering to lean toward her, and she felt, or imagined she felt, his breath faintly against her neck. Text, she whispered back, then pointing at the computer. I have to work now. Right, sorry, he said quickly, righting himself. The warrant is closed for the annual town meeting, Peter Cook was continuing, but the selectmen are interested in hearing people's thoughts on this. Tonight is mostly in the interest of maintaining transparency. Okay? So let's get started with a presentation of the situation from ZBA Chair Helen Javier. And then we go through a section where various people are speaking about various issues related to the fact that this wealthy man is suing the town so that he can park his helicopter where he wants to. And in between each of the speakers, hippie Richard Burton stepped in toward the podium and spoke gently into the mic, introducing each speaker almost apologetically. Could she describe his tone as apologetic in her write-up? Probably not. Everett wouldn't like it. And anyhow, Peter Cook would look at her sadly the next time she crossed paths with him at the post office. The next speaker was not originally slated to speak, he said. We're grateful that Mr. Orion Smith was able to come here on short notice and contribute his thoughts on this matter. Orion Smith's a wealthy guy with the helicopter. There was a rustle of surprise. The malefactor himself? Joanna was the happiest person in the room. That would make fantastic copy. Thank you, Mr. Moderator, said a voice, and oh no, crap, she knew that voice. She looked up, her stomach sinking. Yes, it was him, the fellow who had just asked to take her for a drink. Clarification, who had asked to take her for a drink as soon as he realized she wrote for the Journal. She had just been played. He had such nice eyes. So, that's the short version. Thank you. I have no idea where we are with time. How are we with time? Okay, so if anyone has any questions, it's fine if you don't, because I think everyone here has probably either read the book or talked to me about it already. But we can just gab about things. Yes. I want to thank Leah for being here because her husband is actually in another tent being a moderator right now.
Oh, that's all right. This is really not a question. I loved the way you did the styles of the Gazette and the MV Times. I mean, you really had it spot on.
Thank you.
And I understand you have, in fact, written for both papers. How many people have, at different times, I mean, not simultaneously like your protagonist, written for both papers? Do you know?
I don't. Well, we both had two of us.
You, yeah.
Have you done it?
Okay.
There's
So it can be
there's a
done.
small cadre of folks who were all working for the Gazette who stopped freelance.
Oh, this was earlier when they
yeah,
started
no.
the Times.
In my life,
Right.
I had been freelancing for the Gazette, and I and about half a dozen other people all stopped at around the same time and then sort of got seduced into working for the Times, when ironically someone who had been our boss at the Gazette and then went away and then came back, started working at the Times. So I hadn't actually worked for her at the Gazette, but a group of us kind of migrated with the editor. That's about 10 people at least right there.
Okay. I have a second question, which is, what was the relationship between the Grapevine and the MV Times?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked me this, because I heard an apocryphal story.
Oh, good.
I love this story. I tried to get it into the book, and I couldn't figure out a way to. And Louisa, you might know the real story, so I'm going to tell the story that I heard. And I don't think it's true, but I feel like it accurately reflects the relationship between the two. Is there anyone here that doesn't know what the Grapevine is? Okay, so the Grapevine was this teeny little paper. It made the Gazette look like huge. I mean, it made the Times look huge. It was this teeny little, like, egalitarian everyman's paper that was published in the tiny little building that is next to the Up Island Auto, the gas station in West Tisbury. And it existed in the 70s and into the early 80s. It was even more of an everyman's paper than the Times was, but it was much more liberal than the Times. When the Times started, it was started by some Republican businessmen, and this was sort of like, if you wanted to be liberal, but you wanted to not feel elite, the Grapevine was your paper. And it, rumor has it, this is the story that I heard from someone who works at the Gazette, that the Grapevine was going to go out of business because once the Times came along, they were far more organized and they had lots of advertising dollars, and so they were going to take away the everyman readership. And the Gazette secretly backed the Grapevine so that the people that might go over and start reading the Times would not read the Times. They would keep reading the Grapevine. And then eventually when the master plan was, let's keep the Grapevine going long enough for the Times to fail, and then we'll let the Grapevine fail too. But that did not actually work. The Times was able to take off and thrive and eventually found its footing. But do you know that story, Louisa? Have you heard that?
Here.
We're just sitting here arguing. Sorry. We're just over here arguing about who started the Grapevine, so I don't think you're going to get a whole lot of elucidation from this two-generation reporting duo here.
Jerry Kelly,
not Bob Carroll.
I don't know.
Yeah, he was the editor, yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
It is extraordinary and wonderful, and I know that there's more to the story than I'm about to make it sound like, but the fact that there's two independently owned newspapers on this tiny little island And they're weekly and they're all year round. I mean, that's extraordinary. And the way that they're able to support themselves is very different. And they know that like they're pretty transparent about that. But like there are major cities that is not true of. So like kudos to all of us and to both papers for making that happen. Really.
And that they're independent.
And that they're independent.
That's really important.
Yeah. Yes.
I got something for you.
This is more on the technical end of it. How does you pay for a book that's in print compared to when it's on digital? The ebook versus the paper book, how are you paid?
I have no idea. I probably should, but I don't know. I'm paid an advance, and then once the book has earned out the advance, but I don't know if that's just the print. Like I should know that. Mm-hmm. Do you know? Oh, okay. Here's someone who knows better than I do, and she's going to explain it, and she's going to rock my world.
No, it's kind of sad. You get, as an author, a much bigger royalty from a physical book than you do from an ebook.
That explains a lot.
Although they have managed to keep a certain amount of standard royalty on the ebook, even though Amazon at first wanted it to be a nugatory amount. They got beaten back through brave publishers like Hachette standing up and saying, no, the author needs to be paid, even if it's an ebook.
Is that why they did the slow burn on Hachette?
That is exactly why they did. So that seems to have been put into abeyance for a while. And the happy news is that ebook sales have steadied. They tend to be about a third, and they're not going up. People like physical books.
Yay for physical books. Thank you, Geraldine. Thank you.
I actually have a question while I've got the microphone. Sure. I love that there's a wonderful twist at the end, and I don't want to do a spoiler on that, but there's a wonderful moment where you realize that this is actually
I know what you're talking about.
Pride and Prejudice.
Thank you for saying that. I love that.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you about how early in the creative process did you know that you were going to upend this story?
Later than you would think. I knew that there had to be more to Orion Smith than meets the eye, and I suspected. Were you here when Rick Russo was doing his talk? Somebody asked him something about ending books, and he said, "You have to have some idea of where you're going, or else, like, why would you write it?" But he frequently doesn't know where the books are going, and I'm a structured junkie. I think because I grew up doing theater, the whole beginning, middle, and end is really important to me, and so I don't like starting a book until I know exactly how it's going to end. That was not the case here, because the original idea was just the premise. It wasn't the plot at all. It was the two papers, and then it evolved. So I knew that there would be something going on with him more than meets the eye. But I think I was at I'm starting to panic moment before I actually realized that. And then when I understood what I needed to do to make it work, it was this sort of like eureka, huzzah! Now I know what's going to make this work. See, from your mouth to God's ear. Is anyone here from my publisher? There was a really spectacular, the publicity was not handled well for the book. And the sales figures reflect that rather dramatically. So I think they would probably let me do a sequel, but I don't think they would give me enough of an advance to live on. And then it becomes a self-perpetuating problem, because if they don't pay you much of an advance, then they don't have a lot to recoup, so they don't put a lot of energy into marketing it, and then, So that's, I think the only way that what I would like to do instead of writing a sequel is I would like someone to buy the rights and do it as a miniseries, and then instead of a sequel, there could just be a second season. So if anyone could arrange that, please let me know. Yes.
Does writing about a place you live or lived change your view of that place when you're done with the book?
In this case, it did a little bit, partly because, like I said, I had to look at it through eyes other than my my default pair of eyes, but otherwise, I've spent my entire life thinking about the Vineyard, because as soon as I went off to college, I just missed it. It was home. in a way that nowhere else was ever home. And I think part of why I failed so spectacularly to actually purchase real estate off island was because this was home. Why would I like saddle myself with a mortgage someplace that wasn't home? But during the time that I was off island, the vineyard changed so much that I was constantly shifting through different attitudes about it. And so I think maybe what's happened is I've been reminded of different points of view. But otherwise, no, I think I had to be there already to start in order to write it. Yeah, I think that's my final answer. Does anyone have any other questions? All right. Thank you guys so much for braving the heat. Thank you.